Ladies and gentlemen, welcome in. My name is Sal Vetri, and I'm teaming up with OnlineGambling.ca to talk to you about the several different types of fantasy football league types and get you to pick the one that is right for you. Today we're going to be talking about the standard league types for fantasy football. These standard leagues, you get to redraft your teams every single year, so you're not tied to this team for the next 2 to 5 years. It is just that single season. Now you can make transactions in these league formats, and you can add players, you can drop them, and you can even trade players. The main scoring difference between a PPR league and a standard league is that point per reception. You get 1 extra point per reception, so it does change up your strategy a little bit when it comes to drafting players. You want to start targeting players who actually catch the ball more often. Even if they don't get a lot of yards, just those receptions themselves will actually weigh more in a PPR format. A tip that I have for you in PPR formats is to target pass-catching running backs because they get the best of both worlds. They get to get the rushing stats on the ground and the touchdowns there, and then they also get to get the receptions in the air and get that extra coveted point per reception. Now the pros of standard leagues are it's very fun. Every single year you get to redraft with your friends, your family, whatever it might be, and it's simple. Each week you can set your lineup and it doesn't take a ton of work. Now the cons of it are the exact opposite of that. If you're somebody who's a true grinder and really keeping in with this, you'll still be on somewhat of a level playing field as everybody else because it's just set up simply for everybody to have a lot of fun. So even if you are putting in a lot of work, you'll have an edge, but not that much of a greater edge as you might in some other different league types. Touchdown-only fantasy leagues are very simple of an overview of what they are. You only accumulate points for touchdowns. Your players can have 300 rushing yards or passing yards, and you get no points for that. It's all about the touchdowns, baby. So I want to share with you my strategy for these leagues. You want to target players that are heavily used in the red zone, that is within the 20-yard line, close to the end zone. An even better strategy is to look at stats where the running backs are being used inside the 5-yard line, these goal line red zone running backs. On a more general stance, you can track the teams that are in the red zone the most. This kind of gives you an idea of which offenses are the best. So looking at teams that are in the red zone the most will allow you to say this running back has a lot of potential, this quarterback and these wide receivers have some potential to score touchdowns because they are getting into the red zone 1 or 2 more times per game than some of the other teams in the league. Alright, are you listening? Because this is going to be a major tip for you that's going to help you get an edge over your league mates. Draft mobile quarterbacks, rushing quarterbacks. Quarterbacks who run the ball are going to be huge upsides in the touchdown-only league because they'll score 4 to 5 to 6 touchdowns in a season that just any other quarterback is not going to do. But then they also have the upside of throwing some touchdowns in, and a good amount of them, 20 to 30 touchdowns. So draft mobile quarterbacks in these touchdown-only leagues, target running backs that are going to get the ball a lot inside the red zone and inside the 5-yard line, and target wide receivers who have targets in the red zone. The pros to this league type are if you are paying close attention and you are savvy and you are tracking the red zone usage and those end zone targets every single week, you're going to have a huge edge over the competition. You'll be able to pick up the running backs, the receivers, the quarterbacks who are heavily involved in the red zone and are going to get the touchdowns. The cons to this league are that in its principle, it's almost very random and it can start to get boring if you have some of the best players in the league and they're putting up huge receiving numbers and huge rushing numbers and passing for 300 yards, you get no points for it. So it can start to get really annoying if you just don't have the proper variance that day and you're getting unlucky by your players not scoring touchdowns. Individual defensive player leagues are really going to thrive on getting turnovers, fumbles, and interceptions, but also sacks. So a tip that I have for you is look at players who have a high pressure rate, means they're pressuring the quarterback but just not getting there. That usually is an indicator that in the future they will start to get sacks, which usually tends to give them fumbles and potential touchdowns. So when you're looking for trade targets for individual player leagues, look for players with high pressure rates but low sack totals. The main scoring difference between a PPR league and a standard league is that point per reception. You get 1 extra point per reception, so it does change up your strategy a little bit when it comes to drafting players. You want to start targeting players who actually catch the ball more often. Even if they don't get a lot of yards, just those receptions themselves will actually weigh more in a PPR format. A tip that I have for you in PPR formats is to target pass-catching running backs because they get the best of both worlds. They get to get the rushing stats on the ground and the touchdowns there, and then they also get to get the receptions in the air and get that extra coveted point per reception. Now the pros of standard leagues are it's very fun. Every single year you get to redraft with your friends, your family, whatever it might be, and it's simple. Each week you can set your lineup and it doesn't take a ton of work. Now the cons of it are the exact opposite of that. If you're somebody who's a true grinder and really keeping in with this, you'll still be on somewhat of a level playing field as everybody else because it's just set up simply for everybody to have a lot of fun. So even if you are putting in a lot of work, you'll have an edge, but not that much of a greater edge as you might in some other different league types. In an auction draft format, each owner starts with a fake allocated a set amount of money of usually between $200 and $300 to start to bid on players. You go by one and putting a player on the board, and each person gets to bid up for that player. A strategy in auction leagues is to nominate a player that you don't really care too much about and put them on the board early so that some of your league mates can start to spend their money early so you have a lot of money to sit on for the players that you actually want. A pro tip that I have for you is you don't have to spend a lot of money on quarterbacks and tight ends. Most of the quarterbacks and tight ends will score very similar amounts of points, so it doesn't make them as valuable. You should try and set aside 75% of your auction draft formats for running backs and wide receivers and lean more of that towards running backs because they're going to be the most valuable assets for you in fantasy football. And a bonus pro tip is don't overspend for players. There's going to be a time in a draft where you really like a guy and you want him so bad, but that's exactly what your league mates want you to do. They want you to spend more money so that later on in the draft, you can't buy some players that you really like. Overspending for players is a detriment to your team. The pros of the auction format is that it takes a little bit more strategy. It's not as simple as just clicking a player and drafting them. You have to allocate some of your bankroll, you have to think about percentages, and you have to really think about building a team with some set amount of money. It takes just more strategy. But on the flip side of that, it takes more strategy. It could also be a con for you if you're somebody who doesn't like putting in more work, if you just enjoy drafting players and going down through a draft in the traditional manner of selecting players and not having to think about how much bankroll, how much budget do I have left. So the pros are actually the same as the cons depending on your perspective and viewpoint. In a keeper fantasy football league, your entire team does not reset each year. You actually get to keep 1 to 3 players depending on your league setting from one year to the next year. So if you had one of the best players in the entire league, you can opt to keep that player. The strategy for the keeper formats is similar to the Dynasty Leagues, in which you want to target younger players who are starting to succeed in their career with the arrow pointing up, because then you'll get more out of them the following years, or at least you have a better chance to, as opposed to some older players who might be on the downturns of their career. A pro tip that I have for you is to try and limit your keepers from 1 to 2 to 3 at most each year. Otherwise, you start to take too many players out of the player pool, so when your draft day comes, it's not as fun for you and your league members. The pros of the keeper league are that you get to keep some awesome players from one year to the next. If you had a couple of players that just won you your fantasy championship, you get to reward them by keeping them on your team for the next year. The cons of the keeper league are that you don't have as many players to redraft the next year, so that special moment that comes around, you won't have as many. So based on my pro tip, do not have too many keepers each year. Have 1 to 2 keepers. Don't try and get crazy with 4 or 5. Otherwise, your redraft is not going to be fun for you and your league mates. Dynasty fantasy football leagues are likely the most advanced fantasy football leagues right now. You are in it for the long haul. You have to make sure that your league mates are in this thing for at least the next 3 to 5 years, if not longer. It's very similar to the NFL in that your team does not reset each year. The team that you draft that first year of your league, you get every single year. Now you get to improve upon this with a rookie draft that is typically 4 to 5 rounds once the rookies come out of college each year. But after your first year, your startup league is what they call it, you're set with that team. You only get to improve on rookies and any types of trades you do. So it's very similar to the NFL that you are GMing this team for the long haul. The major strategy for these types of leagues are to just look at younger players who have the potential to be good for you for the next 3 to 4 years. You do not want to be drafting older players with some of your high draft picks or trading up for some older players who you might only get 1 or 2 years out of. It's always a balance between win now and win in the future. Set yourself up for now, set yourself up for the future, and that's really what NFL teams deal with every single day. So the strategy is finding the proper balance between winning now and the future, and a good way to do that is by having a lot of young talent on your team that just naturally will have upside. My pro tip for you is to target young pass-catching running backs coming out of college. Get them in your rookie drafts, make trades for them right now, because these are the most valuable assets in all of Dynasty Leagues, and they do not come all that often. So young pass-catching running backs, rookie running backs are a great option as well that you can target and get into your Dynasty League formats is going to be a major boost for you in the future. Some of them might not work out, but if you take enough stabs on them, you're going to have the next best running back in the NFL. The pros of the Dynasty League are that you get to manage the team. The successes and the failures are based on your general management decisions, so you actually get to test run piloting an NFL team based on the fantasy format Dynasty League. The cons of the Dynasty format are that you need people to be in it for the long haul. So if you start to have some league mates that drop out, it can really ruin the league. It's also a lot of work, so be prepared to put the work in, but if you are ready to do so, you can surely take advantage of this format. In Survivor Fantasy Football Leagues, they're commonly referred to as guillotine leagues because the lowest scoring team from that week is usually kicked out of the league. They are cut off. The strategy in these league types is to win for that specific week. You want to just survive, as the name itself says. So you want to be really tracking the waiver wire, potential trades, and just players that popped up from the previous week that did very well. Why did they do that? Get some context into it. Is it something that is going to be sustainable or not? That will give you a better advantage over your league mates when it comes to putting in waivers and acquiring new players in transactions each week for your team. A pro tip that I have for you is don't be afraid to stream your quarterback, your tight ends, your running backs, whatever it might be, off of the waiver wire. Choose a different quarterback each week. Go based on matchups. Look very closely at the defenses and mainly the secondaries that quarterbacks are facing. If they're facing one of the worst secondaries in the league, don't be afraid to go get them. Remember, you're just trying to survive for this week. You're not trying to win 6 weeks from now or 7 weeks from now. Just get past this week, so build the best lineup you can, even if it means picking up a worse skilled quarterback just because they're in a good position and good matchup. The pros of this league is that every single week is a playoff atmosphere. When the fantasy football playoffs usually come around, it gets very tense, it gets very exciting. Now you get to do that every single week in a Survivor league. The cons of this league is that you might be done after 1 or 2 weeks, so instead of having months to play during the football season, you might be that person who loses after the first or second week, and now you're done. You're done in your fantasy football league for the rest of the year. That stinks. Daily fantasy sports leagues are just very short leagues that are maybe 1 day, 1 hour, or 1 week long. Most of the daily fantasy sports contests are salary cap based, which means that you have a certain amount of allocated fake money to build your lineup with players based on their value. Good players will be more expensive. You can then take these lineups and compete against one person in a head-to-head contest or thousands of people in a large field, guaranteed prize pool tournament. The strategy in daily fantasy sports formats is always to be balancing your floor with your ceiling. Ceiling is upside. Ceiling is as many points as they possibly could score if everything goes right. The floor is the stability and consistency. So you want to have a certain amount of balance of players that you can really rely on and trust, and then some players that might be a little bit riskier, but if it's their day today, they're going to pop off. My pro tip for you is that if you are playing in tournaments, you want to be rostering a quarterback and a wide receiver from the same team. Why? Well, there's a lot of correlation, the highest correlation that we've ever seen in NFL between the quarterback's success and their wide receiver's success. The less that you have to get right, the better the chance that you knock down a large field guaranteed prize pool tournament and you take home some big money. So correlating players from a team, a quarterback plus a wide receiver, a quarterback plus a tight end is a pro tip for you. The pros of daily fantasy sports leagues are that it's very frequent, they're weekly, you don't have to be stuck with your team forever, and they're even hourly if you wanted to play based on that day's games. The cons of these league types are that usually the sites take a rake, a percentage of your entry fees, so that no matter what, you're usually starting in the hole when you're trying to win some money in tournaments or head-to-heads. There's also a lot of professionals in the daily fantasy sports area, so you have to watch out for people that are just very, very good so that you're not going in with a negative chance of winning. The Best Ball Fantasy Football League type is a new league that is just very heavily focused around the draft itself. You will typically draft 18 players, multiple from each position, and each week you don't have to set a lineup. Whichever player at each position scores the most points for you will be automatically entered into your lineup for that week. So you don't have to set a lineup, you pretty much draft and you forget it. There's no transactions, there's no trades, there's nothing. You do the draft, you set it, and you forget it. So it's very heavily based off of how good of a drafter you are. The strategy for best ball leagues is to balance consistency with upside. It's okay to get players who pop off for 30 points some weeks and then only have 2 in best ball formats, more so than standard leagues or dynasty leagues, because you're only relying on those big weeks because you know you're automatically going to get them into your lineups. So the best way to summarize it is that you weight ceiling, the upside that players have, a little bit more than their consistency and stability, their floors. So ceiling over floors in best ball leagues when it's coming down to close calls. A pro tip that I have for you in this is try and do team stacks. Team stacks mean that you get a quarterback, a running back, and 1 or 2 wide receivers from the same team. If that team ends up having a fantastic year, it likely means that your best ball league each week is going to do really, really well. So you're trying to correlate, take as much of the luck out of it as possible, and just get less things right by team stacking. The pros of best ball is that it just takes no time after the draft. You don't have to worry about starting players, forgetting to set your lineup, trades, and it's just everybody on the same playing field. Once you draft, you're set. The cons of best ball leagues are that if you're somebody who is really, really good at paying attention during the season, paying attention to players who are trade targets, additions, transaction, waiver wires, all of that stuff, and you're grinding, you're not going to be able to use that skill set that you have in the best ball format. Thank you so much for tuning into this video. My name is Sal Vetri, and if you are feeling confident enough right now, I urge you, check out the description down below and start playing now. Best of luck in your fantasy football 2020 season.